President Trump just returned from China, but Taiwan is rattled by some of the comments that the president has been making. I want to talk about it, what happened, the bigger picture, what this means for Taiwan. Did President Trump do a mistake? Did he blink on Taiwan? And where do we go from here? Before I start, I just want to give a quick pitch of what I'm trying to do here. Independent, authentic, curated topics that I really believe that in this age of AI, curation is the value proposition, this human artisanal curation. There's so much information out there, and my target audience for what I'm trying to build here, busy professionals and students, want to be informed about the world, but are just so busy and have little time. And so that's smart brevity. I respect your time, and that's what I'm trying to do here, and just show and share topics that I genuinely find interesting and that I think matter in the world. So let's set the stage about this summit that happened in China this past week. It's the first time a US president has visited China since 2017. I remember when that happened. I was in middle school, but I was still interested in this kind of stuff, as I am right now. And it was a big deal, right? It was a big deal. They toured around the Temple of Heaven. They had a tea ceremony, which, even the Temple of Heaven, it's very interesting because when that Temple of Heaven was built in the early 1400s, the US was not even discovered yet. And in China, there was this renaissance of art and culture. Shen He, the famous sailor, he was going to Kenya, he was going to Sri Lanka and Hormuz, actually. He was going to the Strait of Hormuz to meet with Persian dignitaries there. And so it's a very interesting kind of that Trump was taken there. Now, the US comes in the middle of a very tough war with all the options to get out of this war are super, super tough. Because there's reporting that shows that Iran can hold on tight and keep the Strait of Hormuz closed until the midterms. They can hold 4 more months. And the pain clock for the US, it's a bit different because they got the midterms to contend with. Before President Trump flew to China, he was asked a question. He said, "I don't care about Americans' financial situation." Direct quote, and you can only imagine how a quote like that's going to be sliced and diced by Democratic strategists in what already looked like a very bleak year for the Republican Party. And so Trump coming with a bit of shaky ground. Now, to be positive about the United States, Trump traveled with all these CEOs from Apple's Tim Cook to Jensen Huang from NVIDIA. And in many ways, it shows that, and there were CEOs who didn't travel, right? Think of Dario from Anthropic or Sam Altman. That really, the technological and educational might, a lot of it is still with the United States. And let's not forget, the US is the number 1 GDP by a lot. Yes, China's a clear number 2, but the US still reigns supreme in a lot of categories and a lot of metrics. Now let's talk about China. There was this very interesting article by the Wall Street Journal that came out on Tuesday. I'm going to put it in the description below, and I recommend everyone reads it. And it reads, "She's China, dazzling technology, military muscle, and an economic mess." Because she is doing really good in China in a lot of things, but the economy is kind of struggling, right? They have some of the same labor market issues that we're dealing with in this country. If we look at the unemployment rate, China's unemployment rate is 5.4%, and the US is 4.3%. So it's not that different. And in many ways, the big picture here, because I want to get into some of the meaty topics that I want to talk about, but the big picture here is that the US and China, they met as equals, which even that by itself, that's a huge win for China. You guys can look at the 2000 videos from the 2008 Olympics and the fans that were there in the opening ceremony with the drums. It was this huge, the China entering the global stage, and now they meet as equals for good and for bad, right? So let's talk about Taiwan and the island of Formosa, as the Portuguese called it. I'll start by saying there was a lot of good that came out of the summit. I think having the summit is a good thing because having the 2 global superpowers that are going to define the AI age is super, super important. And so just in that, it was a win. Scott Besson talked about how there were talks about AI safety that happened there and that will continue to happen with Chinese AI leadership and Chinese AI experts in the government. Coming out in many ways of what happened with Anthropic's Mythos model. That's another video, but you guys can look it up. It's a model that's really good at finding bugs and critical software in tech in banking, in telecommunications, and there's reporting that like China is very well aware of this and very concerned about this. So this is like a global issue, and so getting China and the U.S. talking, very good, objectively, very good. But there's also the issue of Taiwan, which is like this huge. I personally think, guys, that like Taiwan it's a very risky situation. But because if you look at World War One and what started that, right, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand by Serbian nationalists in Bosnia, it was this event, but it started, it got all these countries involved, and all of a sudden there was fighting in Cameroon, and it's this crazy thing. And if you look at like AI, the superpowers, the tension, like, I don't know, there's just a lot of risk in Taiwan. And it matters because Taiwan is responsible for like 92% of high-end chips are produced in Taiwan. Yes, President Biden with the CHIPS Act was trying to like reverse some of it with huge chips factories being made in Columbus, Ohio, in Arizona, near Phoenix. But nevertheless, it's still the case. Who do we blame for this? Like, why? Like, some people have asked me, like, why is Taiwan so like good at making chips? Like, why are we so reliant on it? Like that's such a risk for us. I mean, maybe you can blame President Clinton. Like, he had an opportunity to like reverse some of it and bring it to the U.S. He was a big fan of globalization, but at this point, it's kind of like too far gone. That yes, the U.S. like I really believe like if I was president, like I would continue doing what Biden was doing with the CHIPS Act and like more, like invest more, because it is a huge risk in like possibly starting World War III. What President Xi really wanted were rhetorical concessions, which is this big, like, fancy policy wording, but like in human words, it means like the way Trump speaks about Taiwan really, really matters. And did Trump blink? That's the big question. And I think yes, he could have said less, right? Like he's very known, like President Trump's very known to talk to the press and be very transparent, the most transparent administration in history when it comes to the press. So I'm going to read some quotes of what he did say. So he was talking to Sean Hannity of Fox News, and he said, China's a big country, Taiwan's a small island, it's far away from us. And he says, and I quote, that's a little bit of a difficult problem. So it's a bit different, right, than like Joe Biden's like very hard line of like, we will protect Taiwan. This is kind of more wishy-washy, which is exactly what she wanted. Now, Trump clearly doesn't like to talk about Taiwan. He was asked about it in the Temple of Heaven, and he looked visibly nervous. I recommend I'm going to actually put that video in the description below. But the reality is that China and the Chinese leadership, if like everyone knows in foreign policy, and if you study foreign policy, they're very, very serious, strategic people, which is kind of the opposite of what happened with Iran, right? Like, and it's like not even like a partisan thing to say it at all. Like, it's been 3 months into this war with Iran. It shouldn't be the case. Like, it should never be the case, especially when like the stakes are so high for Americans and like the affordability. That was an issue before the Iran war. And I'll also say that in many ways, like, this is like China really likes not that they like, but they're like not opposed to the U.S. getting hurt by a war in Iran. China loves it when the U.S. goes in these like Middle East adventures, and so they're kind of in no rush to step in and say something, because at the same time, like if you look at some of the reporting, they're getting their oil. Like, they're getting their oil from different trucks that come like from Iran, through Turkey, through whatever, from oil in Central Asia, oil from China itself, from Russia, right? And so like China borders with Siberia, where a lot of the oil comes from. And so China's kind of like in no huge rush to stop the war in Iran. Not to mention, I mean, they obviously have a stake in it because it's impacting a lot of trade partners very negatively, if you look at Thailand. But still, these things matter because it sets precedents in that, like, I remember when I was in Cambodia, that Thailand was about to invade Cambodia over a border dispute, and the Thai army, they were literally quoting Russia. They were saying like, well, Russia invaded Ukraine and the international community did nothing about it. These things really, really matter. And so the risk here is that something happens, like China invades Taiwan. If the US chooses to do something, which is sort of what Trump is indicating right now, that might be a huge risk for a lot of countries, because like, forget about the big powers, but it might lead to a lot more wars in places like the Sahel in Africa, which is already battered by wars, or like Southeast Asia, or like just different places around the world that people don't really think about all the time, but it can lead to a lot of war, a lot of bloodshed, and a rise in refugees, which is kind of what something that Trump is actually like against. So it might be working against it in that way. But it is a very dangerous flashpoint. The other thing I would say about China that I want to bring up is that China is actually doing really, really good with robots and robotics. That while the US is super good with AI and sort of the brains, like the artificial brains in the AI revolution, China is really good with like the bodies, right? Like the fingers and the everything of the AI revolution. I recommend people watch like the videos of the dancing robots in China. They got robotic wolves. And in many ways, the country that wins the convergence of AI and robotics is going to be very powerful and very dominant. And so there's also that aspect on the background. Now, I don't want to go so much over time, but net, like what's the big picture? What's going on from this, and what's the actual next step from this? I would watch the arms sale. So the US was supposed to give an arms sale to Taiwan, and they stalled it to have this summit. If that doesn't go true, if that doesn't go through in the coming months, that would be a huge win for China. And so I would really watch that. I think at the big picture, China thinks they can get Taiwan diplomatically without war. And it could be something like what Hong Kong is right now. They kind of sort of just merged into China, and when there's dissent and where there's protest, they crack down on it. But like, I think that could be a possibility that you could see happening. Like there's a lot of talk about how like China has this deadline of like 2027, like Xi wants to have military readiness for something like potentially Taiwan. But I don't think they will invade. I don't think they will invade because in many ways, like the Chinese military, people forget this sometimes, but they're really untested, right? Like they haven't been in a major war. So this Iran war might be a benefit to the US in that they get like that real world experience. But in many ways, this has been like a big disaster for the US in that so much of a lot of weapons, a lot of troops, a lot of brigades have been moved from China and the Indo-Pacific region into the Middle East. And so it's just very interesting to see kind of just the lack of focus when it comes to China and when it comes to Taiwan, because like in many ways, like failure to defend Taiwan, it could be a permanent fracture in alliances in Asia. Like there's reporting that Japan and South Korea are very concerned that something to them might happen to what has been happening with Europe, of just lack of support of NATO, a lot of rhetorical attacks against European allies. And so it's very interesting. But don't want to run too much over time. The big picture, I think, it's that it's good that the two countries are meeting, but there is a risk that Trump's been talking too much about or not doing enough to ferment the position that the US will defend Taiwan at all costs. Should the US defend Taiwan at all costs? Well, that's a different question. It's a different, like, bigger strategy question. But if the US intention is to prevent a war and to not give China the illusion that it's okay to invade Taiwan, then this might have been a blinking moment by President Trump. But yeah, I hope everyone has a good rest of your day, and thank you very much for watching.